Kenny MacAskill.
Chairmanship, and I pay tribute to the member both for securing this debate but also for his comments. In-work poverty undermines the whole social contract that evolved in this country after World War II with the establishment of the welfare state. The whole purpose of Beveridge was that people would work, they would pay national insurance, that would provide for their sickness and indeed for their retirement. Those who fell through the gap would be dealt with by supplementary benefit. Work was the route out of poverty. That is no longer the situation. We now have in-work poverty, as others have said. It is something that is unprecedented in recent times. But let's remember, it is not an accident. It is an economic model. That is where it has come from. It has come from the United States. It was brought in, established perhaps first of all by Clinton. But those who haven't read it, I would recommend reading the book by Barbara Ehrenreich, Nickel and Dimed. She was referring to the United States that came about after the reforms brought in 1996 by Bill Clinton with the Welfare Reform Act. That created a low-wage economy. It might have created many jobs, and Clinton dined out on that for a long time until people began to drill down as to what was actually happening. It was a low-wage economy. And she narrates people having to do 1, 2, 3 jobs simply to survive. Not to have to meet medical bills, not to have to pay school fees, simply to live upon because the cost of living made it impossible. That was something that we perceived was the problem of the United States that didn't have a welfare state. That was something that we thought they had and they had created for their people. It wouldn't apply here. We still have a welfare state, but it's beginning to fall apart and not just fray at the seams, but be unroded and corroded and indeed torn down from within. But the whole concept that work was the route out of poverty no longer applies. That simply isn't the case. We can see it all about us. It's not simply, as I say, the statistics that people have referred to, but we're conscious in other aspects. It hits every corner of this country. It applies to every sector. The movie Sorry We Missed You narrated how it affects social care and indeed it affected distribution, but there's hardly a sector that it doesn't apply to. It's not restricted simply to those who are working on zero-hour contracts, because as with the United States, we now have people who cannot live on the hours that they get in one job. They have to do 2 or 3 jobs simply to survive, and we have to make sure that that changes. It is simply unacceptable. It is a breach of that social contract that was supposed to be the benefit of World War II, and yet, as I say, we see risks. So what do we do about it? Well, first and foremost, we have to recognise that this was an issue before coronavirus. It was an issue before the cost of living crisis. It was, as other speakers have correctly testified to, it was predicated on high rents because people were unable to earn enough to be able to meet their rent, and they had to choose between paying their rent or indeed being able to eat. Now that is compounded by a cost of living increase, especially with fuel, but not restricted to fuel because the inflation is hammering into food costs. And we now have a situation where it's not simply choosing between paying your rent, it's whether you can heat your home before you even have the indulgence that you might perhaps want to feed yourself or your children. That society has to change. How do we do it? Well, fundamentally, we have to ensure that, first of all, we have a living wage. A minimum wage, as we currently have it, is not enough. It needs to be a national living wage. We do need to empower trade unions because we are finding that workers are being driven right over. We have to ensure that we have rent regulations because people have to be able to afford their rent. And finally, as we face escalating fuel costs, we need a social tariff and an end to the abomination of these standing charges that are impoverishing people. There's a better way, and this is not the society that was anticipated by generations before.